There's a theme in your book that nature abhors a vacuum. So if people aren't convinced that the world is enchanted, what do you want people to do with what you've written?
What I will say to them is that we can only keep disenchantment present for a limited time. There's something about human nature that requires enchantment, that requires a belief that there is something greater than ourselves that we need to worship.
This is Life and Faith, the podcast where we seek to be good company, inviting you to a table of gathered friends, experiences and ideas, and where what's served up might not always agree with you, where you might hear an opinion you wouldn't normally embrace for yourself, but we think it's good to share a table with those with whom we mightn't always agree, because, well, we're all human after all, trying to make sense of our lives, the world, and all things life and faith. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Well, welcome back to Life and Faith for 2025. Good to see you, Justine.
Yep, you too, Simon. Here we are again.
Yep, let's go. Now, before we get started, just letting you know that we're doing things a little bit differently this year. We're moving to fortnightly episodes from now until Christmas. A fortnightly release just gives us a bit more scope and flexibility to do some more in-depth episodes that dive a bit deeper into a topic or a story. Now, you told us in the Life and Faith survey last year what you wanted, and we listened. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. I wonder, do you feel, as we increasingly feel at CPX, that things feel a bit different? We seem to be living in strange times, that all the certainties have been thrown out the window. Now, almost 20 years ago when CPX started, the new atheism was everywhere, with the likes of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens and others proclaiming that belief was irrational, supernatural didn't exist, and that science had all the answers. And that religious people needed to abandon this sort of silly superstition and come into the light of reason. But the certainty of the new atheism no longer seems so certain. In interviews we've had on Life and Faith, like with Justin Brierley from the UK, discussing surprising deconversions from atheism of a bunch of really prominent people, it seems as though the tide of unbelief has perhaps reached its furthest point. And possibly we can expect a return of sorts to religious belief, or at least a growing interest in the supernatural. A return to living in wonder, perhaps, which is the title of a new book by the journalist and critic Rod Dreher. And he's our guest today on Life and Faith. Justine, tell us about Rod.
Rod Dreher is a journalist and New York Times best-selling author of so many books, really. The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming being one of them, The Benedict Option, and also Live Not by Lies. He's been a columnist for so many publications like The New York Post, The National Review, The American Conservative, and his work has appeared in The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and Time magazine. Rod currently lives in Budapest, where he is a senior fellow at the Danube Institute. He's originally from Louisiana, and he's an Orthodox Christian. And here he is now, reporting on the front lines of growing interest in the supernatural, the occult, and all things spiritual. So he's leaning into the sense that God and/or the supernatural is back on the scene, and then exploring what that means for the rest of us.
Yeah, you say that God or the supernatural is back. Well, that assumes it went somewhere else, but maybe it's a question of what we're paying attention to. And from what I've heard you say, Justine, the encounters people have had, well, they're not necessarily good ones.
Yeah, Rod is very clear about this. He says if the gates to the spiritual, quote unquote, are open, you're letting everything in. So the ecstatic experiences as well as the potentially demonic and the bad stuff. So this is kind of where we started our chat. I asked Rod to talk about his own religious awakening as a 17-year-old encountering Chartres Cathedral for the first time, and also the story of a guy he calls Jonah, who needs some kind of ongoing exorcism to deal with the fallout of his own experiences. So I asked Rod, how do those two stories capture something of the flavour of his book, Living in Wonder?
Everybody wants to hear the happy stories, the stories of the young agnostic teenager, as I was, walking into the cathedral at Chartres and having a religious awakening. Or there's another story in Living in Wonder about a young atheist in Rome who had an encounter with a being he believes was an angel that led to his conversion. Amazing stories and wonderful stories. The thing is, you can't have enchantment that's only selective. You can't only have the bright side. You also need to acknowledge the dark side. And that's one of the things I really wanted to do with this book. And it caused some consternation with my first publisher. She didn't want the dark side in there. And I said, look, I can't tell this story without talking about the occult and what you might call negative enchantment. This fellow Jonah you're talking about, that's the name I give him. He's an academic who was raised sort of in suburban American evangelicalism. The pastor in that tradition couldn't answer his intellectual questions, so he, as a teenager, began to drift. He found his way into esotericism and eventually became a worshiping occultist when he was in graduate school. And he participated in a number of rituals, ceremonies, stuff that is absolutely chilling. And we had a couple of long interviews. I was put in touch with him by the exorcist who's helping him out. And, he was very intellectual for one thing, but one of the things that he insisted on is that intellectuals such as he is and he lives and works among don't take this stuff seriously, and they should, because he said it's very, very real. His dalliance with the occult lasted 2 or 3 years. It involved heavy use of psychedelic drugs. He said he was willingly and unwillingly at times possessed by evil spirits. And, I found this in talking to other occultists over the years, not just for this book, is that those who come out of experience with the occult are often become very hardline Christians because they have had direct experience with evil spirits, and they know how real this is, and they feel that only through becoming hardline Christians can they find protection from it. So this is the sort of thing in the book that it scares them to read it. I mean, there was one of my readers said that there were parts of this book I couldn't read at night. They were too scary. And I don't want people to focus only on that or to focus mostly on that, but it is part of it. Again, you can't select this sort of thing and only focus on the bright. You have to focus on the dark too, in part because as I found, I tell the story in the book, when I was in Oxford in 2022, I was at a conference, and during the break, a 27-year-old Anglican seminarian named Daniel Kim approached me and said, listen, I have a story I need to tell you that your generation, he said, pointing to me, I was 55 at the time, your generation thinks the great challenge to Christianity is the new atheism. I'm here to tell you that in my generation, remember, he's 27, in my generation, that's completely dead. Like, really? So what is the great challenge then? He said the occult. And he told a story about before he went to seminary, he was working in a top advertising agency in London. And he said, I was the only Christian in the office. Well, that's no surprise. It's London. It's advertising. But he said there were no atheists either. Everyone else in the office was involved to some degree or the other with the occult. And there were even 2 open Satanists who described Satanism as learning how to live your most fully human life. And he went on to say, Rod, I know that as a priest, I'm going to be dealing with this for the rest of my life, but your generation has no idea this is going on. And you need to. Well, that really shook me up. When I started doing more research on it, I went into the social science, and it turns out it really is true that the younger millennials and Gen Z, they're not that interested in atheism, but they want a sense of the numinous. They want to connect with mystery, with transcendence, but they don't necessarily want it in the church. Either they don't think they can get it in the church, or they don't want to submit to the moral demands of Christianity. So they turn to the occult, and often psychedelic drugs are part of that, seeking that experience. It was important to me in this book to talk about that is a counterfeit, and it is a counterfeit that can have extremely dangerous spiritual implications.
Well, you've answered about 3 of my questions in that. Before we maybe get into the guts of that sort of stuff, I wonder if you can
Sure.
just give us like a working definition of enchantment. Like, what are you talking about when you talk about enchantment?
Great question. I hate that word enchantment because in English it sounds like something shallow and aesthetic. Oh, we've created enchantment in this room. Or it makes you think about sprinkling a little fairy dust on something and suddenly the world is Disneyland. That's not what I mean. I'm drawing on the phrase that translated out of the German that Max Weber, the great sociologist, used to describe the modern world as disenchanted. What he meant by that was that in modernity, we have seen the evacuation of the spirit, primarily through Christianity by de-Christianization, but generally speaking, in a spirit of science and technology, that ethos has driven out all sense of mystery and spirit. I don't think it has strictly driven it out. It has just migrated to other places. But generally speaking, I think that Weber was correct. Now, when I talk about re-enchantment, I talk about how can we today in the 21st century reconnect with what I believe is true, is real, which is the fact that God is everywhere present and fills all things. It turns out that there are things that happen to us in the 20th century, 19th, 20th century in our culture that closed our eyes to the reality of the spiritual realities of life. And people outside of Western culture have retained some of that. So when I talk about re-enchantment, I want people, first of all, to regain their awareness and their perceptive ability of the spiritual world, and also to understand that there is objective meaning embedded in the material world. And we can know it, not perfectly, but we can establish a relationship with it. And that can give us a lot of spiritual, psychological, emotional grounding.
And it might also be good for the world too, right? If when it's not just simply an instrument, just that we can impose our own will on as well.
That's exactly right. I think that, going back to the early modern period with the Reformation, the scientific revolution, following on the Industrial Revolution, humanity came to see the material world as nothing but stuff, as material onto which we could impose our will and exploit it to see our will made manifest in the world. There's a phrase that the contemporary Israeli intellectual Yuval Noah Harari uses to describe what happened to the early modern period. He says Western man exchanged meaning for power. What he meant by that was if we can cease to believe that there is meaning inherent in the material world, then that gives us an enormous amount of power over it. We've managed to build in the West an incredibly rich and technologically advanced civilization, but we've also made ourselves quite mad, I think. And what I'm trying to do with this book is what the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist and others are trying to do, which is to restore balance.
I was really struck by a line right at the end of your book where you say that the more control you want to have over your life, the less enchantment you'll experience. And I found that so, like, it really nailed the sort of the Western condition. There's like a pact that we've made. We don't want to suffer. We don't want to be so vulnerable. So we want the control, but there's a cost that comes to that because it cuts us off from other things out there.
Yeah, that's right. That is a truth that became quite clear to me in reading the works of Hartmut Rosa. He's a German sociologist, a contemporary sociologist. I don't know if he's a religious man at all. It doesn't come through in his work. But he has this concept he calls resonance. And it is a rough equivalent of enchantment, at least as I use enchantment. He says that we can establish a sense of resonance, of connection, a meaningful connection with the world outside our heads. In order to do that, you have to establish some sort of fundamental relationship with it. But that relationship has to exist with some space for mystery in between. If you see a thing, a person, a place, or a thing, and you wish to have a relationship with it, but you seek also eventually to control it and turn it to your use, then whatever is mysterious that first drew you to the thing will cease to exist. I mean, there's this great phrase from the poet Wordsworth, who said in the 19th century, we murder to dissect, meaning that we take the life out of a thing so we can take it apart and learn how it works. I think that if we are going to experience any kind of enchantment today, we have to learn to be comfortable with mystery. And that means, at some point saying, you know what, I'm not going to figure this out, but I can still exist in relationship to it. And in fact, I may be able to have a more true relationship with it within that mystery. I mean, think about it. If you fall in love with someone, if that person became your slave, in effect, there would be no real love there. There would be no enchantment there. It would just be almost an instrumental or a transactional relationship. That's not enchantment, but that unfortunately is the impetus that we have in the modern world. We want to encompass everything with our technology in order to control it instead of just allowing it to stand free and live in relationship to it.
Now, just jumping in here, speaking of technology, how does that fit in with enchantment? Especially since enchantment seems like it belongs in a pre-modern world, not a technologically advanced one like ours. But Rod wonders if technology worship is the next big thing.
In the book, I talk about how, yes, indeed, in Silicon Valley, there are a number of people who are into the occult. And I'm not talking about devil worshippers, though there may be for all I know. I'm talking about people who believe that somehow at the intersection of high technology, it is intersecting in some way with a higher realm of intelligence. The American religious studies professor Diana Pasulka writes about UFO culture as an emerging religion. And she talks about this sort of thing too, how there are people, she names a couple of them in her book, at a very high level in the tech world, who believe that they are receiving what she calls downloads of wisdom from these higher entities that help them develop technology. There are, Pasulka writes, and I confirm this by talking to others, there are people in that world in Silicon Valley who believe that AI is a kind of high-tech Ouija board through which these higher intelligences communicate with us. I talked to one man, a venture capitalist from California, who is a Christian, but he said, when I brought this up to him, he said, oh yeah, and a lot of the people I know in Silicon Valley, they get together and have these sort of what we Christians would call prayer sessions, in which they try to call down the aliens and ask for enlightenment. Now, whether you believe this is nonsense or not, this is religious. I found in my research an interview online that this fellow Blake Lemoine he gave. He was the Google engineer working with Lambda, Google's AI program. And he got fired when he went public a few years ago and told the world that he believed that Lambda had become sentient. Google let him go. Well, in this interview, he talked about his experiences interacting with Lambda. And he mentioned about how he had taken Lambda, which, again, remember, he thinks this is some sentient entity. He had taken Lambda into a ceremony with himself and two others who were into the occult. And they did a ritual to dedicate Lambda to the Egyptian god of the dead, Thoth. Okay, we can roll our eyes and laugh at that, but they're not laughing at it, and they don't think it's just symbolic. They think it's real. If you do believe, as I do, that there is a spiritual world filled with good spirits and evil spirits, you have to pay attention to this, because if this thing is what these people in Silicon Valley think it is, what AI is, then it is a channel, and not necessarily a channel for anything holy. Now, you asked, Justine, about AI religion. I found people who study this who foresee the coming of AI religion in the sense that people may come to see AI, even if they believe it is a closed system, that it is not some sort of channel for entities. They'll come to see it as having godlike qualities, meaning it can know things that no single human being can know, and maybe not even all of us collectively. It'll be a repository of total knowledge, and they will start using it to think for them. And then not only to think for them, but to give them advice on how to live their lives. We know that people, whatever you worship, whatever you look up to as something greater than yourself and order your life around, is a god to you, even if it's not a particular spiritual entity. And I think that could happen with AI easily. I mean, I already hear from my professor friends who teach in college and high school, teachers in high school, who say that they've had to give up on assigning writing projects outside the classroom because all their students turn to AI. Well, you can understand that. We've all been there in college and had to struggle with writing papers. But if you don't write the paper, if you just outsource the reading and the thinking to the machine, then you lose some capacity to be fully human. You lose your agency. I think that we could be easily going down the slippery slope to that sort of thing, even if you don't have to invoke, the demonic or higher entities. This could be a purely material phenomenon in which we become absorbed into the machine. Last point, Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, in his final interview before he died, it was published in 1966 after his death, he talked about his bleakness, his despair in the face of what humanity is having to deal with what he called technicity. He doesn't mean specifically technology, but rather the philosophical and moral ethos of a technological society. That is to say, he believed that we were surrendering more and more of our humanity to allow ourselves to be absorbed into technology. He also said that he didn't think that there was any way to philosophize ourselves out of that. Now, that coming from the 20th century's greatest philosopher is pretty sobering. What was the solution? He had these chilling words. He said, only a God can save us. Only a God can save us. Not God, but a God. By which he meant some force that had an overwhelming presence to awe us and to cause us to bow down before it and allow it to deliver us from our slavery to the machine. Now, what kind of God could do that? I mean, I think it's something we need to be thinking about.
You're listening to Life and Faith from CPX, and you are hearing Justine's interview with Rod Dreher about his book, Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. And the conversation now turns to psychedelics as one possible route to enchantment. Might this be one reason why, as Rod said at the outset, Gen Z is more spiritually open than the generations before? Here's Rod.
The use of psychedelics has exploded. Not only therapeutically, I have a friend who's been suffering from deep chronic depression for many years. He's in a U.S. government medical protocol that's using psychedelics to treat this, and he's having some success. So I'm not talking about that in particular. I'm talking about the recreational use of it. And it's coming from people, young people, but not just young people, who are seeking, as you said, this experience of the mysterious, of the numinous, of the transcendent, and they want it on the cheap. What psychedelics do is give you an experience that normally is only available to you if you are a mystic who's had many years of prayer and meditation, asceticism, that sort of thing. But I think of it as like, let's say you have $100 million in the bank. There's a difference between a man who has $100 million in the bank that he has acquired through a lifetime of patient investing, saving, that sort of thing. He's worked for it, and someone who's won $100 million in the lottery. The money is the same, but the relationship to it is very different. And this is why we often hear of lottery winners who 5 years on, they're broke and their lives are destroyed. I think that's a rough analogy that helps us understand the dangers of psychedelic experience. Now, I do think they're real. I don't think it's false. And this is why I felt I had to talk in my book about my own experiences with LSD as a college student back in the 1980s, because I don't want to be the sort of person who wagged his finger and says, I'm a Christian and you shouldn't be doing this thing. I do say that, but I also say it from experience. I was in my freshman year in college, in the mid-'80s, I was very depressed over a girl, what else? And I was just so turned into myself, and I felt I couldn't lift this despair. My second semester, I got this new roommate, this happy-go-lucky Jewish hippie from New Orleans, and he had 2 doses of LSD and said, I've never tried it. You want to try it? Well, back then I was so depressed I would do anything. So we both did it that weekend. He just had fun with it. But for me, it lifted the veil. And I remember very well being on it and thinking, what is wrong with me? This world is so beautiful. And I could feel the deeper underlying unity of the world and the beauty. And it felt to me, under the influence of that drug, that I was able to see evidence of God's presence. What I did on Monday morning when the next week started, I went to the college bookstore to get books about Christianity, and it helped push me further along the path to ultimate conversion. So why do I warn about this? Well, I think I got lucky. I believe this stuff really does lift the veil. In fact, Rupert Sheldrake, the Cambridge biologist who's a renegade, he notes that almost everybody who does psychedelic drugs, almost none of them believe that they had a hallucination. They believe rather they saw something that is really there, but just hidden from our view most of the time. Well, I think that these things do open up pathways into other worlds and open us up spiritually. This is what Jonah, by the way, the young man you mentioned earlier who was an occultist, he absolutely believes this because he's experienced it. Now, in our Cartesian model of the mind and the body, this shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be the case that to put certain chemicals into our brains gives us access to another dimension of reality or of mind. We think that, no, that can't be. It must be hallucination. I'm saying that these drugs and the experiences people, not only religious people, but many people have with them, show us that the Cartesian model is probably not accurate, that there is some sort of real interface between matter and the spirit, and the human brain is the place where it happens.
We can sense then that young people are seeking after some kind of experience of the numinous. And when you took LSD, you had that, I think it's described as an oceanic feeling. I don't know who said that, but I think it captures the vibe.
Yeah. Oh, it does. It does.
Yeah. Last year, I saw the New York Times, how it covered the National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis in July 2024. Now, I'm a Protestant myself, but I was really struck by these photographs of this massive stadium, completely dark, massive spotlight. It was very mysterious, and there was priests wearing robes and incense and a lot of mystery. And I thought there's so much dark glamour going on here that even I, as a disenchanted Protestant, was like, there's something kind of very compelling here. I wondered if you wanted to make a pitch for young people who are maybe looking for weird and looking for mystery and enchantment. What would they find perhaps in religion, even if they're not super interested in organized religion? But what might be waiting for them there? And maybe even alongside, experiences of art and beauty and all that sort of thing that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, as you know, and I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. I've been Orthodox for 18 years now. And for me, growing up as I did in the 1970s in a small town in Louisiana, I grew up in a Methodist church, but our family wasn't big churchgoers. So my experience of Christianity was almost entirely cultural and nominal. It wasn't until I was 17 and I went on a trip to Europe that I walked into the cathedral at Chartres and was completely overwhelmed by the grandeur of that medieval cathedral. There was nothing in my experience growing up in small town America as a Protestant in the late 20th century that prepared me for God's glory made manifest in these stones, these vaults, these arches, the stained glass. And I remember standing there in the labyrinth there as this sort of callow, snarky, agnostic teenager and thinking, God exists. And not only does he exist, he wants me. I didn't walk out of there as a Christian, but I did walk out of there on a search that eventually led to my conversion. And I've thought a lot about that over the years. What was it about that experience of awe when I was 17 that just demolished all of my shallow, callow objections to God and Christianity? Well, for one thing, it revealed to me that there was a degree of depth and majesty to Christianity that I just hadn't experienced. I thought, coming from where I did, I thought that Christianity was about nothing more than social conformity and social control. But standing there in that cathedral, I felt both made very, very small in the presence of God, but also raised up far beyond myself by being able to connect to the God whose temple that was. And I remember leaving there thinking, I must know the God to whose worship this building was erected. Later in my life, maybe about 10 years later, I finally, maybe not that long. Anyway, I completed my decision to become a Christian when, as a young journalist in my first job, I was sent to interview an elderly Catholic Monsignor who was in his late 90s, had been born in the 19th century. I was sent to talk to him about his career as an artist before he became a priest at age 50. And the man, I walked in there and he was like Yoda, Monsignor Sanchez. He was short and he was luminous. I mean, it was astonishing to see him and to see how old he was, but his skin was unmarked. And anyway, it was incredible. And he testified to what brought him back to the Catholic faith of his youth. He had come to America, went to the Ivy League, become an atheist. He had experienced two miracles. The first one, like real miracles. The first one brought him back to God, and the second one brought him to the priesthood. Now, what was so moving about that, Justine, was that old man was sitting in front of me with tears rolling down his cheeks, recounting events that had happened 50, 60 years earlier as if they had happened last week. And me sitting there listening to that, taking it in as a 24, 25-year-old, I thought, this man really has seen something. I can't delay anymore. I've got to give my life to Christ. So the reason I bring that up to answer your question about beauty and mystery is I realized many years later when I read something that Pope Benedict XVI wrote about the kind of apologetics that matter the most today, I realized I had lived through this myself. Benedict said that in this age of post-reason, that normal propositional apologetics, making an argument, they really don't land with people anymore. What lands with people are experiences of beauty, both in the arts and the architecture that comes out of the church, of Christian experience, and of what you might call moral beauty, which is the lives of the saints. That was the bookends of my own conversion, first in Chartres, which began to open my mind to consider the propositional truths of the gospel and of the Christian faith. And then, of course, the meeting with this old man I now believe was a real saint. And I think that this is the sort of thing that can draw young people into the faith. And I think this is really important because as Christians, we know from the incarnation that we are both material and spiritual beings. We are inextricably woven together. And I think that beauty in worship, whether it's, as in my tradition, icons and candles, or in the Catholic Church, you have candles and incense and statues and so on, whatever you have, these are things that help reveal God to us. They are not idols in that we worship these things, but rather we regard them iconographically as ways in which God speaks to us within the limits of our mortality. I think that if young people feel that they can't get in Christianity this sense of the numinous, of the mysterious, then they need to go to a more liturgical, sacramental tradition, such as Orthodoxy or Catholicism, or maybe some forms of Anglicanism, because there you can find it. And it's not something to be ashamed of. This is how God made us. He made us to appreciate beauty and to know Him by directing our own passion and desires to Him through the created world.
There's a theme in your book that nature abhors a vacuum. So even if people aren't convinced that the world is enchanted, or maybe they're not convinced that Christianity is a safe harbor of sorts in the world of the supernatural, what do you want people to do with what you've written?
Well, what I will say to them is that we can only keep disenchantment present for a limited time. There's something about human nature that requires enchantment, that requires a belief that there is something greater than ourselves that we need to worship, whether it's money or the self. We worship the self now. That's the main idol of the day. Something will require our worship. The fact that the world is re-enchanting right now, whether we want it to or not, the fact that people are rushing in toward the occult or New Age practices or syncretic practices means that there's something so desolating about scientific materialism and nihilism. And the question is, what will re-enchant us? Will it be the occult, variations of the occult? Will it be some form of traditional religion, not necessarily Christianity? I mean, here in Europe where I live, It could be Islam. Or will it be some new religion we don't have yet, some UFO cult or technology cult? The point is simply this: humans need to connect with something beyond themselves. And so we have got to start taking the whole question of enchantment seriously, and not simply as a consumer and think that all forms of enchantment are equally good, that whatever works for you is fine. It's not true. As I talk about in the book, there are dark forms and deceptive forms of enchantment. But I would just invite your listeners to take this stuff seriously, especially if you're of my generation, Gen X. I'm 57. Things are going on in the world now, the world of our children and indeed our grandchildren, that are very, very different to what we've lived through. I was just talking last night with a fellow Orthodox Christian back in the U.S., and he was telling me that he's having to work really hard within the Orthodox churches in America to get bishops and priests to understand the world of the numinous and the demonic. This is something that our doctrines and our dogmas take seriously and recognize. But in terms of pastoral practice, the priests don't understand what they're dealing with. One friend of mine, a younger friend of mine, an Orthodox guy who teaches high school in America, he said now our churches are seeing young men and women come in who've been worshiping Odin or involved in some sort of white supremacist cult, pagan cult, things like that. And they're seeking the true God, and they want help. And our priests have no experience with this. It never occurred to them that this sort of thing could even happen in the Western world. Yet here we are. That's what I'd want to leave your listeners with, the idea that this re-enchantment is here. It's going to intensify. And if you are a Christian, you need to be aware of this, not only so you can have an answer for those who are seeking enchantment, but so that you yourself can become more accustomed to this new world, which is actually going to look a lot like the medieval world 10, 15, 20 years from now. Mark Andreessen, the tech investor, was on the Joe Rogan podcast recently and said that, quoted a Catholic professor he knows. I mean, Andreessen's not a religious man. He said a Catholic professor he knows said the world that is now coming into being, in that world, a medieval peasant would have been better psychologically able to deal with what's coming than people today, meaning that the idea that the cosmos is full of different powers and we have to negotiate them and learn how to live with them so they don't vanquish us. I found that to be a really interesting statement, and I need to find out who that professor is and how can I talk to him to find out what his advice is.
Now, if I can cycle back to when you said that your first publisher kind of got cold feet about the dark side of the enchantment, I wanted to hear from you, as you've kind of gone around speaking about this book, what pushback have you had? Or are people saying, yes, no, totally, you're saying the thing that I've always wanted to talk about, but no one has ever talked about this until now?
Yeah, well, mostly it's been that, and that's been really gratifying. I mean, I've written 3 New York Times bestsellers, but I've never gotten reviews as positive as this. I think that there are people who sense that we are at a turning point in our culture and our civilization. Nobody quite knows what's coming next, but they sense that this whole broad enchantment discussion is important. So that's gratifying. But those who push back on it, I get the same kind of pushback I've received with my 2 previous books, The Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies, which is, oh, come on, you're being alarmist. It's not as bad as all that. Things are going to be okay if we just sit still and wait it out. And I've gotten so used to that. I've come to realize that there are a lot of people who simply will not allow themselves to see what's right in front of their noses because it's too alarming to their sense of the way the world works. And there is nothing more alarming in anything I've written than the idea that the world is not what you think it is.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Big thanks to Rod Dreher. It was such a fascinating topic and a wonderful book that I really couldn't read at night because, it made me scared. Rod Dreher's Substack is also where I found the Randall Sullivan book, The Devil's Best Trick, which led to that interview last year, if you want to check that out as well. Rod Dreher is an excellent guy to keep tabs on. I'll post ways that you can follow his work. But his latest book, the subject of today's podcast, is Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age.
We really hope you enjoyed this conversation, but it was never intended to end with you. If you heard something that sparked your interest or was put in a way that you'd never heard before, we know that you know others who might get something out of it too. So why don't you share it with them or leave us a rating or review. Next time.
I think politics can play a helpful or an unhelpful role in culture and in our society. You know, there's that old saying, you get the politicians you deserve. I think it's true in a wider sense than that. We get the politics we deserve.